Nobody told you this. Your church has been open to this verse your whole life. John 3:3. The verse that every revival is built on. The verse underneath every crusade invitation, every altar call, every Gallup poll asking Americans to identify themselves. The phrase that Jimmy Carter used in 1976 to describe himself to a nation. The phrase that Newsweek put on the cover of its October 25, 1976 issue. The cover that named that year the year of the evangelical. Born again. Two words that have become the entire architecture of personal salvation in modern American Christianity. Two words that frame the question everyone in evangelical culture is asked at some point in their life. And those two words come from one Greek word in one sentence in John 3:3. One word. And the standard scholarly lexical reference used by biblical scholars in seminary classrooms worldwide calls that word, in the lexicon's own language, designedly ambiguous. Not unclear. Not difficult to translate. Designedly ambiguous. Meaning the ambiguity was not the result of a lost manuscript or a faded text or a poor translation choice by someone who did not know better. The ambiguity was built in. The word Jesus chose in John 3:3 carries two distinct meanings simultaneously, and the Bauer Danke Arndt Gingrich Greek-English Lexicon, the BDAG, in its third edition, published by the University of Chicago Press, places that verse under both meanings at the same time. The lexicon does not resolve it to one. It lists both, because the word itself was chosen, deliberately, to carry both. Now, here is what you were almost certainly taught. Born again means a second birth, a moment of conversion, a new beginning, a decision. That is one meaning of the Greek word. But the other meaning of that same word, in that same sentence, in that same context, is born from above. Born from a heavenly source, born of divine origin. And in the Gospel of John, this word appears 4 times total. John 3:3 is the first. The other 3, John 3:31, John 19:11, and John 19:23, are translated from above in every major English translation in existence. Not one of those 3 is ever rendered again. Not in the KJV, not in the NIV, not in the ESV, not one. This is not a footnote. If Jesus was not telling Nicodemus to repeat an experience, but was inviting him into a new origin, a birth that comes from above, then the question Jesus was asking that night is not the question you were handed. Stay with me through this, because the evidence does not stop with the Greek word. There is a 1,000-year translation chain that hardwired one meaning into Western Christianity for a millennium. There is an early church whose reading of this passage has been quietly set aside. And there is a 300-year cultural development that turned a deliberate ambiguity into a fixed evangelical formula. All of it has to be laid out in sequence for this to land the way it should. And when you see what the evidence adds up to, what Jesus was actually offering that night looks different from anything you have been handed. So go back with me to the night it actually happened. Not to a stadium, not to a revival tent, not to a poll on a clipboard. Go back to a single conversation that takes place in the dark, recorded for us by the Apostle John in the 3rd chapter of his Gospel, and pay attention to who is in the room, because the church has spent 2,000 years quoting what Jesus said to this man without ever asking why this particular man needed to hear it. His name is Nicodemus, and John tells us 3 things about him in the opening verses, and every one of them matters. He was a Pharisee. He was a ruler of the Jews, a member of the council that governed his nation. And he came to Jesus by night. He did not come in the daylight where his colleagues could see him. He came under the cover of darkness, carrying a question he could not afford to ask in front of the men he sat with. This is not a peasant. This is not a fisherman pulling nets on the shore of Galilee. This is one of the most educated religious authorities in Jerusalem, a man who had spent his entire life inside the Hebrew Scriptures, and he comes in the dark because he has seen something in Jesus that his whole framework cannot account for. And listen to how he opens. He says, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." That is the posture of a man who is conceding ground. He is not hostile. He is not laying a trap. He is reaching. And Jesus does not answer the question Nicodemus asked out loud. Jesus answers the question underneath it. He says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." Now here is what I need you to understand before we go one step further. In your English Bible, in the version your pastor preaches from, in the version printed on the bookmark in your nightstand drawer, that phrase reads "born again." 2 words. And those 2 words have been carrying the entire weight of American evangelical identity for 50 years. They have been the password, the dividing line, the thing you either are or are not. But Jesus was not speaking English. He was not speaking Latin. The conversation that John preserved for us was carried to us through a single Greek word. 1 word. And that 1 word does not mean what the English makes you think it means. It does not point you backward, sideways, to a repeat of your own beginning, the way the English born again quietly trains you to think. It means something else first. It means 2 things at once. And the man standing there in the dark heard only one of them, and he heard the wrong one, and his confusion is not a footnote to this story. His confusion is the key that unlocks everything that follows. So before you ever decide what born again means, you have to meet the word that stands underneath it. You have to see the 7 Greek letters that every English Bible flattened into 2 familiar syllables. Because once you see that word for what it actually is, this verse will never sound the same to you again. And that word is exactly where we are going next. The word is anothen. In the Greek it is spelled with 7 letters, and it sits in John chapter 3, verse 3, as the hinge of the entire exchange. And here is the thing that almost nobody in the pews has ever been told. Anothen is not, first and foremost, a word that means again. Anothen is a word that primarily, in its most natural and most common sense, means from above, from the top, from a higher place, from God. Let me show you what that does to the sentence. When Jesus says, "Unless one is born anothen, he cannot see the kingdom of God," the first and most natural way a native Greek speaker would hear that is, unless one is born from above. Born from God. Born from heaven downward. Not born a second time on the same flat plane you were born on the first time. The English born again points you sideways. It points you backward to your own beginning, as if Jesus were describing a repeat of something that already happened to you once. But the Greek points you upward. It points you to a source outside yourself. It points you to God reaching down. And this is not a fringe claim. This is not a theory somebody invented late at night on the internet. The standard scholarly Greek lexicon of the entire field, the reference work that every seminary student in the world is trained on, called BDAG, the Bauer-Danker Lexicon in its 3rd edition, lists from above as a meaning of anothen, and it describes the way the word is used here in John 3:3 with a remarkable phrase. It calls the word designedly ambiguous. Designedly, as in on purpose. As in, the ambiguity is not an accident of language. The double meaning is the point. John reached for this exact word precisely because it can be heard 2 ways, and the entire conversation that follows is built on the gap between the 2. Now stop and feel the weight of that for a moment. The single most important word in the most famous salvation verse in the American church is a word that the world's leading lexicon describes as deliberately carrying two meanings at once. And the English translation you have been handed, your entire life, flattened it down to only one of them. It picked again. It threw away from above. It took a door that was built to swing in both directions, and it quietly nailed it shut on one side. And then it handed you the verse as if the other side had never existed. And you have read it that way, and sung it that way, and built an identity on it that way, never once told that a whole other meaning was sitting right there in the original. But maybe right now you are thinking, fine, but how can we actually know which meaning John intended? Maybe the again reading is just as legitimate. Maybe this is a coin flip and I am making too much of one Greek word. It is not a coin flip, and I am not going to ask you to take my word for it, or BDAG's word for it, or any scholar's word for it, because there is a far better witness available, and it is John himself. The same John uses this exact same word 3 more times in this very same gospel, and every single time he reaches for it, it does not mean again, not once. And that is what I am going to show you next. Here is a principle that every honest student of Scripture lives by. The best dictionary for a writer is the writer himself. If you want to know what an author means by a word, you do not start with a theological assumption you carried in with you. You start by asking how that same author uses that same word everywhere else he wrote. And John gives us 3 more chances to find out exactly what he meant by a nothing, because he uses it 3 more times in this very gospel, and the meaning every single time is unmistakable. Stay right here in chapter 3, just a few verses past the conversation with Nicodemus. Verse 31. John is writing about Jesus, and he says, "He who comes from above is above all." He who comes from above. That phrase, from above, is the word anothen, and there is no possible way on earth to read it as again. It is not saying Jesus comes a second time. It is saying Jesus comes down from a higher place, from heaven, from God. From above, the same word from verse 3, only a handful of sentences later, plainly means from above and cannot mean anything else. Now jump forward to chapter 19, the trial of Jesus in front of Pilate, the Roman governor. And Jesus says to him, in verse 11, "You would have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given you from above." From above. That is a nothing again. And again it cannot possibly mean again. Jesus is not telling Pilate his authority was handed to him a second time around. He is telling Pilate that every scrap of earthly authority descends from heaven, from God, from above. Same word. Same direction, same meaning, from above. And then one final time, in that same chapter 19, in verse 23. The soldiers are dividing the garments of Jesus at the cross, and John describes his tunic, woven in one piece from the top down. From the top. That word, top, is another one last time, and here it is describing a plain physical direction, something running from the upper part downward. So count it with me. 4 times John reaches for this single word across his gospel. 3 of those 4 times, plainly, undeniably, with no room left for argument. It means from above, from the top, from a higher place. And only in one place, only in John 3:3, the one verse the American church has built its entire identity on, has the church insisted it must mean again. The author's own usage votes 3-1 against the reading you were handed on a bookmark and from a pulpit your whole life. And this is not a scholar reaching across the centuries to overrule the text. This is John, the man who wrote the verse, telling you in his own pages what his own word meant. He is the witness, he is the dictionary, and he never once uses a nothing to mean again. And here is what makes it even harder to wave away. The one place that supposedly breaks the pattern is the one place where a man heard the word wrong out loud, on purpose, in the dark. The exception is not really an exception at all. It is the scene of a misunderstanding. So watch what that man does the moment Jesus speaks, because his stumble is about to prove, in his own words, that Jesus meant from above all along. Watch what Nicodemus does next, because the text is about to hand you the proof in Nicodemus's own mouth. Jesus says, "Unless one is born another." And Nicodemus, this brilliant teacher of Israel, this ruler who has spent his life inside the Scriptures, immediately stumbles. He says in verse 4, "How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born?" Do you see what just happened? Nicodemus heard the again. He heard the temporal, horizontal, do it over a second time meaning of the word. And he heard it because the word genuinely carries that meaning too. That is the whole trap built into a nothing. And Nicodemus walks straight into it. He pictures a grown man crawling back into his mother's body. He pictures a literal, biological, physical repeat of his first birth. And he says plainly, that is impossible. This is what scholars call the Johannine misunderstanding, and it is a technique John uses all through his gospel. A person hears Jesus on the lower, earthly, literal level, and then Jesus corrects them upward to the spiritual reality he actually meant. It happens again and again. Someone hears living water and thinks of a bucket and a well. Someone hears about bread and thinks only of their stomach. Every time the misunderstanding is the setup, and the correction is the revelation. And here, Nicodemus thinks Jesus is describing a second trip through the birth canal. So how does Jesus correct him? This is the part you cannot miss. He does not say, "No, Nicodemus, you have the timing wrong. I meant a spiritual second birth instead of a physical second birth." That is not the correction at all. Listen to the actual words in verse 5. Jesus answers, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God." And then verse 6, "That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit." And then verse 8, "The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear its sound, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit." The correction is not about again. The correction is about source. Nicodemus, you are thinking about flesh, about wombs, about your own body trying to do something a second time. I am telling you about the Spirit, about water, about a birth whose origin is not down here at all, a birth that comes from above. Jesus takes the very word Nicodemus heard as again, and he explains it by pointing to water, and to the Spirit, and to wind that arrives from somewhere you cannot see, and leaves for somewhere you cannot follow. Nicodemus's mistake was hearing again. Jesus' answer was from above. The man asked about going backward into a womb, and Jesus answered by pointing upward and outward to something descending from God. And that little phrase he used to do it, "born of water and the Spirit," is the next thing the church quietly walked away from. Because for the first 1,000 years, the people closest to the apostles knew exactly what those words pointed to, born of water and the Spirit. When a modern American evangelical reads those words, he has been trained to hurry past the water. He treats it as a metaphor, as poetry, as the natural birth that simply gets contrasted with the spiritual one. But that is not how the people closest to the apostles read it. That is not how the men who learned Greek as their mother tongue read it. For the first several centuries of the church, when a believer heard born of water and the Spirit, he heard one thing, and that thing was baptism. This is not some controversial fringe reading. The connection between this verse and the waters of baptism is one of the most consistent threads in all of early Christian writing. The leaders and teachers who carried the faith in the generations right after the apostles died read this passage, and they saw the baptismal water. They saw a person going down into it and rising up out of it, born from above, born of water and spirit, exactly as Jesus had said to Nicodemus in the dark. The new birth was not a private, silent decision made in a chair with your eyes closed. It was something that happened to you from above, in the water, by the Spirit. And remember what we have already established about that water. The word for baptism in the Greek New Testament is baptizo, and it does not mean to sprinkle. It means to immerse, to submerge, to plunge something all the way under. It was the ordinary Greek word used for dyeing a cloth, where the fabric had to go completely under for the color to take hold, and it was used of a ship sinking beneath the waves. The earliest Christian instruction manual we possess outside the New Testament, the Didache, written around the year 100, describes baptism as immersion in living water, and it only permits pouring water on the head as a last resort, when no other water is available. Going under, coming up, born from above, through water and spirit. Now I want to be careful and fair here, because the point of all this is not to start a fight about exactly how and when baptism ought to be done. Honest, faithful believers have disagreed about that for centuries, and that is not the battle I am fighting tonight. The point is something far simpler and far more disturbing than any argument over mode or method. The point is that the original reading of this verse, the spatial, from above, water and spirit, baptismal reading that the early church held with remarkable unity, has been almost entirely replaced in the modern American mind. It has been replaced by a reading that is private, instantaneous, emotional, and completely disconnected from water at all. Born again stopped meaning born from above, and it stopped meaning what the church understood for 1,000 years. So how on earth did that happen? How does a deliberately two-sided Greek word, with the author's own usage pointing one way and the early church reading it another, get permanently locked into the single meaning of again? It did not happen by accident, and it did not happen across a committee. It happened at one desk, in one decade, in the hands of one man, and that is exactly where we are going next. The man was named Jerome, and the decade was the 380s, somewhere around the years 382 to 385. The Bishop of Rome had commissioned him to produce a single, reliable Latin translation of the Scriptures to replace the messy patchwork of older Latin versions floating around in circulation. The work he produced became the Latin Vulgate, and for over 1,000 years it was the Bible of the entire Western Church. When a medieval priest read Scripture, he read Jerome. When a king or a peasant in Europe heard the gospel, they heard Jerome's Latin. What Jerome chose, the entire West inherited, century after century after century. And when Jerome came to John chapter 3, verse 3, he came to the word anothen. And he had a decision to make that no ordinary reader sitting in a pew would ever see. He had two Latin words available to him. He could write de nuo, which means again, anew, a second time. Or he could write de super, which means from above, from a higher place. The Greek under his pen was the deliberately two-sided word, the door built to swing both ways, but the Latin in front of him forced him to pick one side and nail the other shut. And he picked de nuo. He picked again. Now understand what that does and does not mean. It does not mean Jerome was careless or ignorant. Jerome was one of the greatest linguists the church has ever produced. He knew Greek. He had the word de super sitting right there in his vocabulary. He used spatial, from above language elsewhere, without any trouble at all. This was not a man who lacked the tools. This was a man who, standing at a fork, chose the horizontal road over the vertical one. And here is what should stop you cold. This is the same Jerome whose Latin choices we have already watched reshape the church. This is the man who took the Hebrew phrase for the shining morning star in Isaiah and rendered it with the Latin word Lucifer, and that single choice handed the entire Western world a proper name for the devil that the original Hebrew never contained. This is the same man who took the Greek call to change your mind, metanoia, and translated it as do penance, and that single phrase helped build an entire sacramental system on top of it. Jerome's word choices didn't stay quietly on the page. They climbed off the page and became doctrines. They became the very furniture of the Western Christian imagination, the assumptions people never even knew they were making. And in John 3:3, he did it again. He chose the horizontal meaning over the vertical one. He chose the second time around over the from above. He took a word Jesus used to point a frightened man upward toward God, and in Latin he turned it to point backward toward a womb. The water and spirit reading did not die that day. The early church's understanding did not vanish overnight. But the single most influential Bible in the history of Western civilization now said, in that one verse, born again. Plainly, with the other door nailed shut, and every translator who came after him would work in the long shadow of that Latin Bible. Every one of them would inherit the word that Jerome chose, including the men who first dared to carry the scriptures into English. And that is the next link in the chain, the link that carried Jerome's single decision across the water and into the very language you are listening to me speak right now. Now go forward more than 1,000 years to 1526, to a man named William Tyndale. Tyndale is the father of the English Bible. He is the man who first translated the New Testament into English directly from the Greek, and he did it as a hunted fugitive, hiding on the continent, smuggling printed pages back into England in bales of cloth, knowing all the while that the work would eventually cost him his life. And it did. He paid for giving ordinary English people the scriptures in their own tongue. Nearly every English Bible since owes its bones to Tyndale. When you read the words of the New Testament in English, you are reading Tyndale in something close to 9 out of every 10 words, and when Tyndale came to John chapter 3 verse 3, he rendered it born again. Not born from above. Again, the very same side of the door that Jerome had chosen more than 1,000 years before. Tyndale was working from the Greek. He knew his craft as well as any man alive. But the full weight of 1,000 years of Latin tradition was pressing behind the again reading, and into English it came. And once it was in English, it was effectively set in stone, because almost everything that followed would be built on what Tyndale laid down first. Then comes the year 1611. King James authorizes a new translation, and that version, the King James Version, would go on to dominate the entire English-speaking world for the next 300 years and beyond. And here is the detail you mustn't let slip past you. We have already seen how the King James translators worked under a strict set of royal rules that bent their hands toward tradition and away from anything that might disrupt the established church. They were ordered to keep the old churchly words in place. And under those rules, marginal notes were forbidden, except for the narrow purpose of explaining a Hebrew or Greek word. So when those translators came to John 3:3 and wrote "born again," exactly as Tyndale had handed it to them, they did not add a footnote. They did not write in the margin that the underlying Greek word also means "from above." They did not tell the reader that the word was, by the judgment of the best later scholarship, deliberately built to carry two meanings at once. They left it completely bare. Born again, with no flag, no asterisk, no whisper of warning that an entire second meaning had been left lying on the cutting room floor. And so the most read English Bible in all of history printed the horizontal reading as though it were the only reading there had ever been, in the single most influential book the English language has ever produced, with not one word to tell the reader that anything had been lost, a door that swung both ways in the Greek now read, in plain and unqualified English, as a one-way door. Generation after generation would open that page and never once suspect that there had ever been a choice. But here is what is remarkable. Even after all of that, born again was still, for centuries, only one phrase among many in the Christian vocabulary. It had not yet become the badge, the test, the dividing line, the thing a man would one day stand up and call himself on national television. That final transformation, the hardening of a mistranslation into a movement, did not happen in 382 or in 1526 or in 1611. It happened in America, and it happened recently enough that some of the people listening to me right now lived through the very year it broke. For most of Christian history, born again was a quiet phrase. It sat in the text. People read it. But it was not yet the dividing line of an entire religious culture. What turned it into that line was 300 years of American religious development, and it built in stages, and the stages matter. The first stage was American revivalism. Across the 1700s and 1800s, wave after wave of revival swept the American frontier and the American city. And revivalism needed a moment. It needed a definable, datable, emotional, individual instant of conversion that a preacher could call people forward to, and that a convert could point back to for the rest of his life. The altar call was born here. The come forward, make a decision, settle it tonight machinery of American evangelism was built here, and born again was the perfect phrase for it, but only if you read it as again, as the temporal second birth, as the singular instant when you crossed over from one life into another. The from above reading doesn't fit an altar call nearly so cleanly, because from above puts the weight on God's action descending, not on your moment of decision. Revivalism needed the again, and it leaned on it with everything it had. The second stage was the 20th century crusade, the mass meeting, the stadium packed to the rafters, the radio broadcast, and then the television broadcast, carrying the same call into living rooms across the country, the printed decision card, the counted convert, and born again became the standard shorthand for the entire experience, the two words you reached for to describe what had happened to you on the night you walked the aisle. And then came the third stage, and this one you can put a date on. The year was 1976. A Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher named Jimmy Carter ran for President of the United States, and when reporters asked him about his faith, he described himself, plainly and publicly, as born again. The national press did not know what to do with the phrase. It was so unfamiliar to secular journalists that Newsweek magazine put it on the cover of its October 25, 1976 issue and declared it the year of the evangelical. Gallup began polling Americans on whether they would identify themselves with those very words, and almost overnight, two words from John chapter 3 became a demographic category, a voting block, a cultural identity, a box you checked on a survey. And by the time that happened, the original meaning was buried so deep that almost nobody even knew there was anything left to dig for. From above was gone. Water and spirit was gone. The baptism the early church saw in the verse was gone. Nicodemus and his misunderstanding in the dark were gone. What remained was a private, instantaneous, emotional, decision-based formula, riding on top of a word that the world's leading lexicon says was built to mean two things, translated by a man 15 centuries earlier, who quietly picked one of them, printed without a single footnote in the most influential Bible in the language, and then amplified by 300 years of a religious culture that needed exactly that one meaning and no other. So let me lay every piece of it out one final time, in order, so you can see the whole chain at once. Because once you see all of it together, you will finally understand what Jesus was actually offering that frightened man in the dark. We have covered a great deal of ground together, so let me bring every thread into one place. It started with a word, a nothing. the word Jesus used in John chapter 3, verse 3. And that word does not primarily mean again. It primarily means from above, from a higher place, from God. The world's leading Greek lexicon, the Bauer Danker lexicon, describes the word in this verse as designedly ambiguous, two meanings, carried on purpose. The double sense is not an accident. It is the point. John, the author himself, uses that very same word 3 more times in the same gospel. In chapter 3, verse 31, he who comes from above. In chapter 19, verse 11, authority given from above. In chapter 19, verse 23, the tunic woven from the top. 3 out of 4 times, undeniably, it means from above. Never again. Nicodemus heard again, and he got it wrong. He pictured a grown man crawling back into the womb, and Jesus corrected him, not by fixing the timing, but by pointing him upward, to being born of water and the Spirit, to wind that blows from a place you cannot see. The misunderstanding itself was the proof. Jesus meant from above, born of water and the Spirit. For the first 1,000 years, the Church read those words as baptism, going down into the water and rising up born from above. Immersion, the way the Greek word baptizo actually means, the way the Didache describes it, around the year 100, with pouring allowed only as a last resort. Then Jerome, around 382 to 385, translating the Latin Vulgate, had to choose between de super, from above, and de nuo, again. The very same Jerome who gave the West the word Lucifer out of the Hebrew and the phrase do penance out of the Greek, he chose again, and the entire Western Church inherited it. Tyndale carried it into English in 1526. Born again. The King James translators printed it in 1611 with no footnote, no marginal note, nothing at all to tell the reader that another meaning had been left behind. And then American revivalism and the Crusade movement, and finally the year 1976 with Jimmy Carter and the Newsweek cover and the Gallup polls, took those 2 words and hardened them into the defining badge of an entire religious culture, locked permanently onto the one meaning the original word was never limited to. That is the chain. A 2-sided Greek word, flattened to one side in Latin, carried into English without a warning, and then amplified by 3 centuries of a movement that needed exactly that flattening. And underneath all of it, still sitting in the text, untouched, never once altered, is what Jesus actually said to a frightened ruler in the dark. Not you must repeat your birth, but you must be born from above. You cannot manufacture this. You cannot decide it into existence by the strength of your own will. It comes down from God, from above. And that one correction changes everything about what this verse is actually offering you. It moves the whole weight of it off of your shoulders and onto God's. And I need to slow down now and make sure you do not miss what that means for you, personally, tonight. Because this is the part where it stops being history and starts being yours. Now I need to slow down, because I do not want you to walk away from this with the wrong thing in your hands. I have just spent this entire message showing you that the phrase born again has been carrying a meaning narrower than the word Jesus actually chose. And someone hearing that is going to feel the floor move under them. Someone is going to think, then was my faith real? Then was the night I came forward, the prayer I prayed, the decision I made with my eyes shut and my heart pounding, was all of that built on a mistake? So hear me very carefully right now. That is not what this means. That is not what this means at all. Because here is the beautiful thing. The from above reading does not take a single thing away from you. It gives you more. Think about it. The again reading puts the entire weight on you, on your decision, on your moment, on your ability to choose correctly and to feel it deeply enough for it to count. And that is exhausting. People spend years quietly wondering if they really meant it, if it really took, if maybe they need to go back down the aisle and do it one more time to be sure. But from above moves the weight off of you and lays it on God. It says, the new birth is not something you generate by trying hard enough. It is something God does to you, from heaven, by His Spirit, like the wind that blows wherever it wishes and answers to no one. And remember, that is the exact picture Jesus gave Nicodemus. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it goes. You did not author your first birth. You did not vote on being conceived. You did not lie there in the dark and decide to be born. And Jesus says the second birth is the very same way. It comes down from above. As a gift you receive, not a work you perform. So please, do not let this message rob you of anything. Let it steady you. This is not a message that takes your faith away from you. This is a message that finally tells you where your faith actually came from in the first place. Not from the strength of your decision that night. Not from how hard you wept or how perfectly you prayed, but from the God who reached all the way down from above and gave you the very ability to turn to Him at all. And that is steadier ground than anything the Word again could ever offer you, because it does not depend on you. It depends on Him. It always did. The night you came forward was not the moment you saved yourself. It was the moment you discovered that God had already been moving toward you. The decision you made was real, but it was the answer, not the cause. It was you responding to a wind that had already started blowing long before you ever felt it on your face. And if you are still listening to me right now, if something has been turning over and over inside your chest through this whole message, I do not believe for 1 second that it is an accident. I think that pull you are feeling is the very thing Jesus was describing 2,000 years ago. The wind you cannot see, moving exactly where it wishes to move. The birth from above, beginning. And before we close, I need to stop speaking to everyone and speak to you. Just you. I need to speak now to one person. The person who has been listening to all of this and feeling something stir that you cannot quite name. Maybe you have called yourself born again for years and never knew what the words underneath were really pointing to. Maybe you have never called yourself anything at all, and you have always felt like the religious world was a club you were standing outside of in the dark, exactly like Nicodemus, holding a question you were too afraid to ask out loud. Either way, this is for you. What Jesus offered that ruler in the night, He is offering you, right now. Not a performance. Not a perfect prayer with the right words in the right order. Not an emotion you have to manufacture and then keep alive by sheer willpower for the rest of your life. He is offering a birth from above. A life that does not begin in you, that you cannot ruin by being too weak or too uncertain, because its source is not down here at all. Its source is God, reaching down, the way He always has, the way that word anothen has been quietly testifying for 2,000 years. And Scripture tells you how to receive it, and it is not complicated. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Rome, says it plainly in Romans chapter 10, verse 9. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead, you will be saved. That is the door. Confess. Believe. And the one who is from above does the rest, from above. So if your heart is moving right now, I want you to pray with me, wherever you are sitting. You do not need special words. Just say to Him, God, I cannot give myself a new birth. I have tried to do it on my own strength, and I am tired. I believe that Jesus is Lord. I believe that you raised Him from the dead. Give me the life that comes from above. And if you prayed that, and you meant it, I want you to do one thing. Type it in the comments below. just right, born from above. Let it be the first time you confess it with your mouth, and let this community stand with you, because you are not in the dark by yourself anymore. And before you go, if this opened your eyes to something you were never shown, do the thing that lets it reach the next person who needs it. Hit that like button right now, subscribe so the next message finds you, and share this with the one person you know who has been quietly carrying questions they were afraid to ask in the light, because here is where we end. Nicodemus came to Jesus in the dark, confused, hearing only again. But the Gospel of John does not leave him there. He shows up again, defending Jesus before the very council he sat on. And then at the very end, when the brave men had scattered and fled, it is Nicodemus who comes to help bury the body of the Lord, carrying about 75 pounds of spices in his arms, no longer hiding, no longer waiting for nightfall. The man who first heard only again finally understood from above. The birth had come down and taken hold of him. It always does in the end when God breathes on a soul. And that same wind is still moving tonight, still blowing exactly where it wishes, still finding the ones standing out in the dark, and still calling every last one of them upward into a life that begins from above and never, ever ends.